Young at Heart and a Commitment to Do the Right Thing by Laurel Winters. My father, Robert Thomas Winters, was a mechanic. I suppose most people are inspired by their fathers. I certainly hope so. Without a college education, Bob often thought he didn't measure up to the big shots. But when lives and integrity were on the line, he always demonstrated the highest standards and made us very proud. Growing up in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, he was inspired by his mother. She had been hired out by age of 12 to help with illnesses on local farms, and eventually she achieved enough training to be a nurse in the town hospital. He learned his work ethic from her, and she would be proud of his commitment to honesty, fairness, and a determination to do what is right. His father, however, although bright and educated, never amounted to much. Bob's mother called his father a, quote, educated fool, as he spent his time writing music and almost mortgaged the house away to pay to publish it. With those role models, Bob learned to work hard, but he had no interest in formal education and never went to college. Instead, he enjoyed life's practical experiences, whether it was fishing in the local creeks or working on engines. He eagerly enlisted in the war effort. His love of engines came in handy as he became an airplane mechanic in the Army Air Corps. While some learned from manuals and books, Bob learned from long practical experience. He had an instinctive understanding of the airplane engines on which he worked. Early in his career, Bob was assigned to a base where their morale was very low. Folks were instructed to put any complaints into a complaint box, and Bob was about to until he noticed that the men who retrieved those letters were connected to the powers in command. Once the chaplain talked to the enlisted guys about morale and got a few of them to confide in him. Those unfortunate individuals were then also disciplined. At one point, one of the soldiers talked to the enlisted men and encouraged them to do what they thought was right. Bob felt the officer was looking right at him when he said that. He felt he couldn't write above the camp commander without being disciplined. What to do? He finally wrote to J. Edgar Hoover and sent the letter off camp to be mailed in town because their base mail was reviewed. A while later, some officials arrived to escort the top commanders off to new bases. They were replaced with someone who earned the respect of the men on the base. Bob received a letter from J. Edgar Hoover thanking him for his service to his country and encouraging him to reach out if there was ever anything else he felt Hoover should know about. The letter is one of our family treasures. Assigned to the Pacific Theater, Bob was line chief in charge of giving the final okay to planes taking off for their assignments. One day, as planes were taking off for their missions, he noticed a sort of hitch in the propellers of one of the planes as the engine revved and got up to speed. He wasn't sure what, but he knew there was something wrong with the plane. He pulled the plane from the lineup. The pilot was furious, screaming at Bob to get him in the air. His supervisor almost overruled Bob's decision, but at the time, mechanics were already working on the plane. When the oil reservoir was opened up, aluminum sludge poured out. The engine was being ground up from the inside. Bob knew that theoretically this was a possibility, but he had never seen it happen. His supervisor asked him, "How did you know?" He just knew. Later, it occurred to Bob that he could hear whines and noises that perhaps others couldn't, allowing him to identify dangerous conditions and protect the planes. Sometimes, Bob served inside the planes, not just on the ground. At one point, the bomb bay doors opened while he was trying to pull the pins to activate the bombs. Fortunately, he stayed on board. He also worked on a top-secret method of detecting enemy submarines off the East Coast. Bob felt strongly that his mother's deep faith and prayers helped to keep him safe during the war, and he had always kept a deep commitment to doing the right thing. After the war, Bob eventually got a job with Capital Airlines and moved with his wife to a trailer in Alexandria, Virginia. After girls began arriving, they moved into a modest neighborhood of new homes for returning veterans. For a growing family, the constant striking and uncertainty of jobs with the airlines forced Bob to look for a steadier job. He eventually joined the Federal Aviation Administration, writing and reviewing procedural and maintenance manuals for aircraft. Since Bob was one of the few employees without a college education, he was not always treated with respect, even though he knew airplanes inside and out. At one point, an FAA pilot flight experienced a near miss in the air. Bob was assigned to evaluation committee. The committee initially believed The pilot error had caused the plane to be at the wrong altitude. But Bob pointed out that the machine that checked the altimeter for the calibration compliance was capable of verifying altitude only up to a certain level, and the pilot thought that he was flying at higher than that. No one wanted to admit their testing equipment might be at fault, and Bob was dismissed from the investigation committee. Many years later, a man walked up to Bob's desk at the FAA and introduced himself. He had been the pilot considered at fault, and Bob's observations and the subsequent adjustments in testing proved that it was not pilot error. The pilot thanked Bob for saving his career. Our dad came from a modest background and loved his family, airplanes, and drums. Although Bob always was young at heart, he had a strong sense of right and wrong and a commitment to do the right thing. His joy of life and strong sense of ethics continued to live on in his children and grandchildren. A native of Alexandria, Virginia, Laurel Winters lives in Akron, Ohio, where she and her husband raised their 2 sons and passed on Bob's message of doing the right thing. An artist by trade, Laurel's works have garnered many awards and been featured in multiple publications over the years. She finds joy in getting her hands dirty in the garden and hopefully from making her world-famous brownies. Laurel is my mother.